Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, from wherever you're joining us. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center based in Beirut. Thank you for joining us today for the second installment of our series on the Ukraine conflict. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my colleagues and friends, Benedetta Berti, who's the head of policy planning in the Office of NATO's Secretary General, Mark Perini, who's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. His research focuses on developments in the Middle East and Turkey from a European perspective, and Sinan Ülgen, who's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels, but who we always claim also in the Beirut office, where his research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, nuclear policy, cyber policy, and transatlantic relations. Let me begin with a small introduction first. Welcome to all of you. And let me just begin with the first small intro about the topic, and then we will have a moderated conversation between the four of us. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously, what we've seen, it's brought Europeans together in an unprecedented show of solidarity. Military, economic, political, and humanitarian support were committed to Ukraine. But now the challenges in the EU, as well as across the world, are mounting. The European Union is facing, multiple challenges, some of which had already begun as due to the lockdown associated with the pandemic, rampant inflation, economic downturn, but also now we have dwindling energy supplies from Russia to internal political divisions. We're seeing the kind of more polarizing politics emerging. For example, in the recent French elections, polls in Spain's Andalusia, what happened in Hungary, challenges to Italy's PM, amongst others. So these multiple threats have forced EU member states to increase their military spending and search also for new oil and gas suppliers. The need to recalibrate Europe's ties with Russia and its ally China have also topped the EU's agenda earlier this year in the aftermath of the invasion. And this is especially true for Germany, which has been transitioning to a new post-Merkel era, but also a country that is quite dependent on Russian gas supplies. Meanwhile, the EU's partnership with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has become more interconnected than ever, even as the alliance has expanded to include Finland and Sweden. And we will talk a little bit about this in a short while. The United States has also re-engaged with Europe. So after the disintegration in transatlantic relations, we've seen reinvigoration of transatlantic ties and the revival of a NATO allowance. All these developments have been compounded by the complexities of what looks likely or what looks like it's going to be quite a prolonged conflict and one that will continue to be with us for quite some time. So, Mark, all of these issues, I'm going to begin with you. All of these issues raise quite a lot of questions around the state of the Union. The European Union was built as a post-World War II peace machinery with the kind of, as we were saying earlier, a never again motto. But right now, good neighborly relations were kind of its operating principles. We're now in 2022, and we have a war in the midst of Europe again. So how significant are the shifts in the EU, and what are their impact on the state of the Union?
Well, thank you, Maha. I think the shift is momentous, as very often in the history of the European Union, movement has been triggered by an outside event more than sheer reflection and planning from inside. But to answer your question, I want to go back for a minute at the very creation. If we put the birth date of the European Union back then, the European Coal and Steel Community in 1950. These came on the heels of the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO. So it was very much, as you said, in the never again spirit. And essentially what we have seen in Europe is appeasement policies, good neighborly relations was also the policy within members, with neighbors, and still is. But the whole machinery was built and equipped as a peacetime architecture, as a peacetime vehicle. So during my own career in the EU, essentially foreign policy was made of two or three things. One was statements. The EU Council of Ministers or the European Council of Heads of State and Government would make a statement. And then we would provide humanitarian assistance or financial support. And if I go back just 32 years ago, in this very place I'm here, the family home near Toulon, this was the day two, almost by the day, of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Of course, member states, the UK back then, France, sent their navies, their military, and so on and so forth, together with the US and a wider coalition. What was the European community of the time going to do? That was the question that was put to me on 2nd of August 1990, because we were a small team of half a dozen people on duty that summer. And essentially, what we found out and what I proposed was financial support to the workers of the frontline states who had to flee Kuwait because of the Iraqi invasion. That meant Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians, Turks, and a few other nationalities from Asia. And within 3 weeks, this was adopted as the first civilian reaction to the invasion of Kuwait, apart from the military. But there was absolutely zero connection with the military aspects, of course. This is the past. Now what we've seen is, at the very moment the EU was adopting its strategic compass in March this year, quickly revised in the last minute to reflect the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But the main trigger, the main input to the decisions that were taken was the Russian aggression, which was not acceptable for the EU. Therefore, you have seen, and everybody knows that, a string of decisions, trade and financial sanctions, energy diversification, embargo, a gas procurement mechanism in the making, the European peace facility used to provide weaponry to Ukraine, and of course, financial support, humanitarian support. And what is even more important is all of this, which is summarized, if you want, in the European Council conclusions of just 3 weeks ago, happened at the same time you had the NATO summit and the strategic concept of NATO being adopted. And what you see is an ever, as you've said yourself, ever closer coordination between the EU and NATO. So essentially, because of the events of the past few years, because of the tragic events of this year, the EU, as Josep Borrell says, is learning to speak the language of power. It's difficult. We've seen hiccups in the process. We've seen one member state, Hungary, delaying for 8 weeks and watering down the end result on gas, oil embargo on Russia. So we have divergences, obviously, within the EU. Some member states are more interested in trade than in military action, etc., etc. But we've made immense progress to the point that I would call 2022 the point of inflection of the EU foreign policy. Now, the next question will be, what happens next?
We will be coming back to this very shortly and to some of the issues you've already raised. But Benedetta, let me turn to you. I mean, you sit in the heart of NATO. And we've seen EU member states take, as Mark said, a number of really unprecedented and unique steps in the history of the Union, including the EU financing for the first time lethal weapons to a third country. These were actually delivered. Boosting of defense cooperation in the face of new threats, and signals of openness to Eastern European neighbors vis-a-vis, basically for them to join secure EU membership. We've also seen the EU use the European Peace Facility, which is a fund for military and defense support for third countries and coalitions that was established only a year ago, and it was used to finance these weapons to Ukraine. So can you perhaps tell us a bit more about, well, one, if you have any comments on the earlier question, but also tell us a bit more, how has the war in Ukraine affected the EU in terms of foreign policy from your perspective and the foreign policy of its member states? And is this a new and arguably bolder foreign policy that will last beyond the current crisis? Will it hold?
Thank you, Maha. And of course, the question of what will happen in the future and how long will and how much our current transatlantic unity and resolve will hold. And I'm optimistic, but of course, that's one of the central questions. But in terms of what has happened so far, I would say that there is, in my mind, sitting at NATO, there has been a clear recognition that there's been a rupture in the European security order after February and the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. In a way, and I agree with the previous statement about the associating the beginning of this war with the sense of being back, going back to history. And some have talked about a European strategic awakening. We have to see, of course, the devil will lie in the details, but I think in general we can say that the February 24th war initiated a process of reckoning for many Europeans about the issue, about the fact that we are in a completely different security environment. And that has come through very clearly at NATO. And as has been said, from a set of assumptions that basically said the Euro-Atlantic area is an area of peace, the European security order is stable, is predictable, relations with neighbors are based on cooperation, common values or common agreements. There is a post-Cold War set of norms and agreements that we can rely upon to ensure the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. Those were all the assumptions that I would say have been shattered with the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And right now we find ourselves in a completely different security environment. War in Europe, instability, fragility over the eastern and southern flank, not the possibility of conventional conflict, something that we can absolutely not dismiss. Peace and security is something we cannot take for granted. So in that sense, yes, there's been a rupture. Yes, there is a heightened sense of urgency when it comes to investing in defense spending, boosting security and defense, and that's happening mostly, of course, through NATO and through the transatlantic framework. But of course, I think I would make a caveat in this narrative, and that is we should be very mindful that. Even though the beginning of this war has been for many a wake-up call, the broader security environment in Europe has been deteriorating for a much longer time. For example, for us as NATO, the real wake-up call was 2014 and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. The transformation of NATO in terms of military adaptation and its reinforcement of its collective defense really started back in 2014. So in that sense, and many of European states, European EU member states, NATO allies on the eastern flank of the alliance especially, had a pretty clear understanding of the Russian Federation's aggressive and destabilizing pattern of behavior way before this war started. But of course, this war has made it even more acute, even more urgent, and of course has made, I would say, this a common perception across Europe and North America. So in that sense, yes, there's been a growing convergence of situational awareness, a growing convergence of the assessment that we are in a new phase. I don't know, we don't know yet how to call it. It's the post-Cold War era, more instability, more unpredictability, need to tackle defense and security much more seriously. And of course, one of the byproducts, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the next round, is the NATO there's been more attention towards collective defense, more attention towards defense spending, and we have taken steps that with a speed that would have been unthinkable, I think, before the 24th of February.
Okay, great. I am going to come back to this because I want us also to talk about the expansion, the inclusion of Sweden and Finland and what that means, but also but I'll just ask you a very quick question before I move to Sinan. Is there a danger of Europe becoming militarily involved other than just shipping weapons, in your opinion?
So from NATO perspective, we've been very, very clear that this is about supporting Ukraine's right of self-defense. This is not about expanding the conflict. And certainly, I think all our communication and actions have been very focused on protecting and shielding the alliance while avoiding an escalation. But at the same time, of course, supporting the Ukrainian rights to self-defense.
Okay, all right. We'll come back to you, Benedetta, in a bit. Sinan, I want to move to you a little bit. As Mark mentioned, there are quite a few sanctions that have been imposed by the EU in response to Russia's invasion, including sanctions on individuals, economic, energy, transport, media, diplomatic measures. So these kind of far-reaching, again, I think the move, it wasn't just on military, but on the sanctions, it was unprecedented. How fast there was a move within the EU on these issues. And arguably, some are arguing that these are the toughest penalties that have ever been applied abroad. So in your view, how effective have the EU's sanctions been thus far in deterring Russia's war campaign in Ukraine? What other tools does the EU have at its disposal if it wants to up the ante against Russia?
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question that will continue to occupy us for a long years to come. The way that the sanctions has been used as an instrument, firstly for deterrence, and secondly for inflicting pain to change behavior. In the initial phase, the use of, or the threat of use of sanctions was obviously not enough for deterrence purposes, and Russia attacked and started the war in Ukraine. However, then in the second phase, I think the Russian leadership was surprised to see how quickly the US and the EU came together for a strong sanctions policy against Russia. Putin may have calculated or may have hoped perhaps that the reaction would be similar to what had happened in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, where the West was divided, where the European response was ineffective because some of the major countries did not want to risk the alienation of Russia on the basis of existing vulnerabilities and dependencies, starting with natural gas. However, now the situation is different. There is indeed a strong and concerted package of sanctions on the table. And this is so far, perhaps historically, the most ambitious sanctions package ever designed by the Western community, even beyond what we have seen with Iran. However, so far, the result is that this has not been enough to change behavior in Russia. And perhaps for the initial phase, actually, it may have produced a political and social impact that is more detrimental to Western societies than for Russia. Because fundamentally, Russia is a commodity-based economy. And as long as it can continue to sell its oil and gas to world markets, it is not going to be affected financially by the impact of sanctions. The sanctions, the way that they are designed, however, will start to affect the productive capacity of Russia, but this is more a medium and long-term impact. Russia will not anymore have the ability to tap into Western technology. Some of the number of Western companies doing manufacturing in Russia are leaving the country, consumer-facing businesses as well. So this will start to have a cumulative impact on Russia's productive capabilities. But so far, because Russia is able to continue to sell its oil and gas to world markets, financially, it's been able to cushion the impact. And therefore, it's going to be critical whether the EU, as one of the largest consumers and clients of Russian hydrocarbon exports, will actually be able to decide on a more stringent set of measures that would target Russian oil and Russian gas down the road. And this is obviously a very difficult decision, particularly was for some countries that have a high dependency on Russian natural gas. And this is the debate that we are seeing now in Western Europe, in the EU. First of all, to increase the impact of the sanctions, but secondly, also to prepare EU, both the different member states, but also the societies, for a possible shock that would entail Russia cutting the gas, as we approach winter.
We're already hearing from the German foreign minister, amongst others, that actually preparing their population that we may see gas shortages in the winter, and several countries are scrambling to try and find alternative sources, as you mentioned. Let me then, I'm going to move to Mark just to ask him to comment on the issues of sanctions, and then I want to come back to you, Sinan, immediately to talk a bit about Turkey and the summit that we saw yesterday. Mark, would you agree with Sinan's kind of view on the sanctions, and do you have anything you'd like to add on this issue?
Yeah, of course, Sinan is right on the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy and society. As long as Russia can keep exporting oil and gas, the sanctions will have a sort of delayed effect. I'm more worried, of course, about the sustainability of sanctions from an EU point of view, because you've mentioned the warning of the German government in his address to the nation a week ago. The French president said that the government is preparing measures, and for the first time in perhaps since the oil shock of whatever it was, 1973, I think, Europeans will have to put an additional sweater during the next winter, because everybody will be asked to heat the house or the office a little less, to cut electricity more often, and so on and so forth. And 1 degree less in your living room is 7% savings on your gas consumption in an average household. So this is going to be an incentive at the beginning. It may well become compulsory. So Europeans, not my generation, but younger people are not used to that. They've lived through the what I call the enchanted parenthesis. After successive wars in Europe, or smaller wars that nobody really felt the impact of, now they're going to feel the real impact, and therefore there'll be an issue of the cohesiveness of a European government, the consistency of what the European Council is going to do, not just because it will be painful for the public, but also because you have some forces within the EU working against. And again, I mentioned Hungary. So, Hungary is really working very hard, quietly, but very hard, against what the EU is based upon. One of the proposals of Hungary today, because the Prime Minister there is especially upset with the European Parliament, is to eliminate directly elected members of the European Parliament and replace them by representatives of national parliament. So this is not just objection, it's a project of deconstruction. So, you know, if we have a combination of the public being, you know, upset or mildly upset, then strong forces within the EU working against sanctions and other measures taken against Russia, plus structural measures, fundamentally political measures against the EU, this is going to be a complicated period. But I'll come back to a mention I made in my first statement. The EU is never as good when it is provoked from the outside. And the outrage at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, unprovoked, is so huge that I think consistency will prevail. Benedetta said very rightly that the alliance, the transatlantic alliance, is on a defensive posture. That's clear. What we don't know is what kind of further provocations Russia will be tempted to undertake against the Baltic states, on the Suwalki Gap, against Romania, that sort of thing. And that would be, of course, a storm of a different caliber.
Indeed, indeed. And actually, some of the threats you're describing, we had our first panel was last week, and it was looking at the the US-Russia relations. And also we were hearing from Andrew Wise with us and Sasha Gobev and Anna, but we were hearing about how the Ukraine conflict is also impacting US politics internally, and the sense that there's also, well, that and among other things, the threat to the State of the Union. Sinan, let me come back to you and talk about Turkey. Turkey has managed to preserve its relationship with both Moscow and Kiev without endangering its own geostrategic calculations. It has avoided joining the ranks of Western countries and imposing sanctions on Russia, and has avoided taking sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, even though it also provided drones to Ukraine. Apparently, the name of the drone now is something very popular in Ukraine. So it's kind of tried to position itself as a mediator. And the Turkish president has played a very complicated game since Russia launched this invasion. I mean, they've hosted initial rounds of diplomatic talks between Moscow and Kiev. They haven't joined the Western sanctions regime on Russia. They continue to import Russian oil. Turkey's kept its door open to Russian travelers, and is also hoping to encourage sanctioned Russian oligarchs to invest their wealth into Turkey's ailing economy. And yesterday, we saw the second MENA summit in as many days between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, which is, of course, the Astana Forum, but this time it was hosted in Iran. So can you perhaps tell us a little bit, how does Turkey under President Tayyip Erdogan, view its role in the Ukraine war, and what does it hope to achieve? And then maybe make a few comments on your take on the summit that we saw yesterday, other than the boomerang effect of President Erdogan making President Putin wait for a minute in retaliation.
Yes. Let me start by paraphrasing a good friend, because I think it's the best way. He's the one who framed this. He says that Turkey is trying to adopt a pro-Ukraine stance without being anti-Russia. So, that is how he actually describes Turkey's position. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, because indeed, as you have pointed out, Turkey has continued to supply Ukraine with the armed drones that are having quite a bit of an impact on the ground. So Turkey is definitely not neutral. Politically, it has been critical of Russia, even before with the annexation of Crimea. It has closed the Bosphorus to the passage of Russian warships. However, at the same time, as again you've alluded to, Turkey has not implemented sanctions against Russia, and in a way has so far been able to explain this careful and balanced diplomacy to its Western partners, so that at least until now, there hasn't really been a great deal of pressure on Turkey to follow sanctions. And the reason why this degree of freedom of action was ultimately granted to Turkey has to do with two things, in my belief. The first one is that Turkey is in a unique position compared to other NATO nations, where in addition to the dependencies on Russia, whether it's on the economy or energy, Turkey has a dependency and even vulnerability to Russia on the security side concerning Syria, because Turkey needs Russia's diplomatic partnership, and that is the reason why the summit happened in Tehran, and Turkey participated in that tripartite format with Russia and Iran to talk about Syria. And in particular in Idlib, where the prospect of a regime attack which could trigger yet another humanitarian catastrophe and an additional wave of refugees is something that Turkish authorities want to prevent at all costs. And this is where they need Russia's partnership. So this is the vulnerability that makes Turkey, or that qualifies Turkey, that puts Turkey in a rather unique position compared to other NATO nations, this vulnerability, this exposure. And that is one reason why Turkey has been able to craft this careful diplomacy, this balanced approach. The second one is that maybe there's also utility in at least one NATO country being able to maintain a degree of political relationship with the Russian leadership. This we've seen in the past with the fact that Turkey was the host for the first ever meeting of the foreign ministers after the start of the war. It happened on the 10th of March in Antalya. Then the delegations at the time when there was still scope for diplomacy met after their initial meeting in Belarus. And now Turkey is still involved actively in the deal to open a grain corridor to allow for the supply of grain to international markets. So this is the type of role that Turkey has been able to play on the basis of this carefully crafted, balanced approach towards Russia and Ukraine at the same time. The question is, how sustainable, this walking this thin line is going to be. And there, of course, it's really going to depend on what happens on the ground, whether, there are more extreme scenarios, or if, Russia, for instance, does indeed play a strong and decides to reduce or totally cut the delivery of natural gas to Europe, then obviously, sanctions will need to be strengthened and there would be pressure on Turkey to join the sanctions and so on. But so far, under current circumstances, this is a bit the rationale that explains Turkey's careful policy. Now, regarding the tripartite meeting in Tehran, the Turkish president had an agenda primarily to get the green light of Russia and Iran to a lesser extent for a new cross-border operations in Syria. We've seen the response from the Iranian side, which was, very negative. On the Russian side, we haven't really heard anything very concrete. So it is more likely that under current circumstances, where Putin actually needs also this dialogue with Turkey as a NATO ally, it may very well be that Russia ends up greenlighting this, and this is important in order to reduce the risks of the operation, given that the two regions that are being targeted are under Russian control. But also the fact that Turkey should be able to use the airspace again in order to mitigate the risks. So that's why getting the green light from Russia is important. It's not that the Turkish military, if it wanted to, it could still go ahead and carry out the operation. But in order to reduce the risks, these are some of the diplomatic outreach that needs to take place. Of course, another agenda was Ukraine. There were, just before the tripartite meeting, there were ongoing meetings in Istanbul with the participation of a delegation from Ukraine, from Russia and the UN, to negotiate or to conclude a deal to allow for the safe supply or the transit of grains from Ukraine to world markets. There seems to be some progress on that count. The Turkish defense minister made a statement to that effect. But then yesterday, Putin also alluded to that and said that there was still a number of angles to be considered and issues to be resolved. So this may be typical Russian negotiation strategy, namely to remain at the table, but ultimately not to deliver. But it may also be that we're, nearing a successful conclusion to the negotiations. Time will tell on that front.
Thanks, Sinan. That actually makes, it rhymes with what we've been hearing also about the outcomes of this summit. And there have been questions about, are we seeing a new counter-alliance, which I don't believe we are. This has been an ongoing relationship for quite some time between Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Some even read the summit as a reaction to President Biden's visit to the region, which again, I don't see that kind of a parallel. I think
it's very transactional. It's very, very careful, very transactional. We can't really frame it as a strategic partnership or anything like that. It's very far from that.
Yeah. Mark, let me turn to you with a very quick question on, what Sinan has said now and what that means in terms of the relationship between the European Union and Turkey, before I move to Benedetta and talk about the EU enlargements.
Yes, well, before I do that, I want to make an addition to Russia's policy. Russia has, since September 2015, increased its presence in Syria in a massive way through the Haimin air base and the expansion of the NATO's naval station. This, of course, has served its purpose in the war in Syria, but it has also helped to maintain a Russian flotilla in the Eastern Mediterranean, the one that couldn't go into the Black Sea due to the closure of the Turkish Straits. But it's more importantly being used to cover, if you want, through the Russian S-400 missiles installed near Latakia, to cover one entire member state, Cyprus, one British base, the Royal Air Force in Akrotiri, again in Cyprus, and also within range is the Turkish-American air base in Incirlik. So that is not a small thing. Then if you consider the best aircraft Russia has in Syria with the most efficient missile, they cover 5 or 6 EU member states from there. And then you have the other step, using Haimin as a stepping stone towards Africa. Russia has set foot in Al-Jufra, which is in the center of Libya, where it has, of course, Wagner mercenaries, but also aircraft, and is using in turn the second airbase as another stepping stone for its operations in Mali, Central African Republic, and so on. So the threat that Russia poses there to the European countries is, of course, nothing close to what is happening in Ukraine, but it is a significant movement that has not happened yesterday, but in the past few years. And, well, you will see a more detailed article from me later this week. So I'll stop here. On EU-Turkey, we know what the balancing policy is. Sinan has given a very rational explanation for it. That is fine. The thing is that EU member states, European Council is puzzled by this attitude, by more than the substance of the attitude, of the policy, but by the total lack of dialogue about it. And of course, this is going together with a drastic reduction in the rule of law architecture in Turkey. So it makes Turkey a NATO member and an EU candidate that is again and again posing difficulties or challenges to the European Union. I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon because we have elections in 11 months' time in Turkey. So that is, of course, as anywhere in the world, part of the foreign policy. All politics are local, as we know, but it creates
very local
puzzlement or more, if you want. But we'll see where this leads us.
We'll come back in a short while to the domestic angle. But let me move to Benedetta, if I may. Benedetta, I want to come back to you on the issue of well, if you'd like to comment on what has already been said vis-a-vis the sanctions and Turkey. But I also wanted to come back to you on the EU enlargement and NATO. We saw, when Sweden and Finland announced in May that they would seek NATO membership, all NATO members welcomed the two Nordic countries except Turkey. And there was a sense that this could mark a historic shift, causing NATO's borders with Russia to double overnight. Can you talk to us a little bit about this, about the process? What does the addition of Sweden and Finland to NATO mean for Europe, Russia, and the world? And then maybe a little bit in terms of Turkey's position on all of this.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I would start by saying that I agree with, maybe after I'll come back to some of the many points that have been covered in the course of the last 30 minutes or so. But firstly, to start with the point that this is truly I would say, historical change in for the alliance, and I would argue, just going back to my previous point, that we need to look at this the beginning of this unprovoked war of aggression as a rupture in the European security order, because I think there's some elements of the reaction that nobody could have foreseen or predicted in January 2022. And I would absolutely say the desire of Finland and Sweden to join NATO is one of those. For both countries, especially for Sweden, this is a big shift in their foreign and security policy. I would say historical one. So definitely something that we could not have seen coming. And part of some of those reactions that we have seen since the beginning of Russia's war, including the reorientation in German foreign policy with the 100 extra billion for defense that Zeitenwende. So there is a number of changes in the European foreign and security policy outlook. Now zooming in on Sweden and Finland. Now that the two countries are officially NATO invitees, so that means that there's been a first step. The second step towards completing their official entrance into the alliance as full-on members is the process of ratification. This is very much ongoing. Each and every allied country is proceeding with ratifying Sweden and Finland's entry into NATO. We are moving very, very fast for historical standards. We are, I think, roughly half of the allies have by now ratified Finland and Sweden's entrance into NATO. So upon completion of this process, which will take some weeks to some months, it's partly a function of the different different regulation and processes that every country has to ratify foreign treaties. So it's something that it's difficult to foresee in terms of the conclusion. But after a few months, we'll have 2 new full members of the alliance. This, as you mentioned, is quite transformative, not just in terms of the geography of conflict, or the geography of the alliance when you look at its different borders, but also in terms of adding to the alliance 2 new members that bring in, first of all, they are highly like-minded. Firstly, they are highly capable when it comes to their military capabilities. They're already highly integrated into NATO, because let's not forget that Finland and Sweden are NATO's 2 closest partners. Now they are invitees, but until a few weeks ago, they were 2 of our closest partners in terms of the amount of exercising, the amount of joint cooperation, political dialogue, and that closeness had even increased after the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine in terms of sharing intelligence. So they were already very, very close to the alliance. But of course, there is a big difference between being a NATO partner and a NATO ally. And of course, that is Article 5. That is the collective defense, the mutual defense clause, which is what you could argue NATO is all about. So clearly, over the next years, this is going to affect the way we look at our deterrence and defense posture. It's going to bring heightened, for example, interest in looking at the High North as a region that is key for the alliance and for the defense of Europe. So there's going to be a lot of concrete adaptation as a result. But for now, I will also say that there is a strong political signal here. And that is that is one that is very important for us to send, and that is, of course, that when it comes to the European security order, we firmly believe that it needs to be based on principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, political independence, and the right of each country to freely conduct their foreign policy and choose their alliances. This is very important because even before the war in Ukraine started, the Russian Federation has put on the table a number of treaties in which one of the requests to open a discussion of European security orders was very much to de facto agree on the Russian Federation having a veto on which country can or cannot join the alliance. And that's something that, of course, from our perspective, would be a slippery slope to this return to a world sphere of influence, and where smaller countries can be bullied by their neighbors. And of course, for us and for Finland and Sweden, sovereign decisions to join the alliance is something that also represents our indirect response to those who want to restore this type of security architecture in Europe. So there's also a very high political value.
Benedetta, let me ask you a question that has come out of this was posed by the audience. So Maz Alawi is asking, what would given the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the EU policy? Well, he's asking 2 questions: the impact of Ukraine conflict on the EU policy on Iran, and actually, I would like to ask you if you think this will have an impact, but then also to what extent will Europe intervene to limit conflicts in the region in order to keep a focus on Ukraine? There's also another question from someone else in the audience, which is Talia Tanir, and I'll ask you the same question, which is, if we're to imagine a European security architecture in 5 years from now, what would that architecture look like?
To Talia's question, that is incredibly important, and that's something that we are obviously having we're thinking about very actively. But I would say that there are some foundations. The post-Cold War security architecture, as it's not viable at the moment because all the principles and norms have been violated to the point where the whole system is shaky. But the norms themselves, those are definitely worth reflecting upon and rescuing. So the norms of having a European security order that is based on states refraining from the use or the threat of force, that respect territorial integrity, that respect each country's sovereignty, that respect each country's right to choose how to conduct their foreign policy, who to ally with, when to conduct their alliances, and that there is no return to a world of spheres of influence where we have countries that are deprived of exercises these basic sovereign rights. These principles, even though they've been violated, and right now we are in a phase in which the system is crumbling, but the principles themselves, I think that's something that we're going to want to bring back to the table and to reflect on how we make sure that we return to compliance. And that, of course, means everyone in the Euro-Atlantic space, and that requires in the longer term also some more profound thinking about the relationship with Russia, which is very much a conundrum, because of course right now with this particular I would argue revisionist foreign policy agenda, it's very difficult to see how to move forward and build a dialogue, and that's why we find ourselves quite honestly in the lowest state of relationship since the end of the Cold War, or perhaps for many decades. So it's quite grim from that perspective.
And so, do you see this impacting? I mean, do you see the conflict impacting Iran's nuclear ambitions, or the EU's position vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear ambitions?
So I'll try to, given that I'm sitting in the middle of NATO and speaking as NATO, I will try not to go too much into what the EU foreign policy, but just out of institutional.
I'll bring Sinan and Mark in a second, and on this
I
question.
think they'll be a little bit less constrained, but in terms of the limiting, the second part of the question, which is more European allies in Europe in terms of how to limit conflicts in the region to keep the focus on Ukraine, I think that would be great. But of course, we also have to be realistic about our collective leverage and toolkit. I think that one discussion that is being quite prominent in Brussels on both sides, both on the EU and on NATO, is certainly how do we refine our toolkit when it comes to supporting countries in our neighborhood that are vulnerable to external interference, coercion, aggression, and of course we're thinking about our eastern neighborhood and about their resilience. But we can extend that to our broader neighborhood. And here the tools are political. A lot of the tools are with the European Union. From a NATO perspective, our tools are more boosting resilience, investing in capacity building, security assistance, and we see that also paying off in the case of Ukraine. But I think ideally, yes, it would be fantastic if we can ensure stability in the neighborhood and bring this. But we need to be realistic that this conflict would have ripple effects that will increase instability in our neighborhood. We're already seeing it because of the food shortages, energy crisis. So I think what is realistic to expect is that there will be more, not less instability, and to prepare for that.
Mark, let me then move to you the question on the EU's position on Iran. But then I also want to bring Sinan and talk a little bit, where we're nearing the end anyway of our conversation today. Unfortunately, I have a lot more questions, but I want to bring Sinan in, and then we'll ask a few more general questions on refugees and food security and others.
Well, on Iran, the EU will continue its efforts. It's really swimming against the stream, but it's part of what the EU is about, of avoiding conflicts. Of course, the visit of the American president to Israel has triggered another wave of discussions or statements in Tehran. So we're nowhere near the end. The other important element I would like to mention here, following what Benedetta just said, is that Finland and Sweden entering NATO is really a historical moment. These neutral countries have felt so bad after the invasion of Ukraine that they have removed the central pillar of their foreign policy. and have voted massively to join NATO. And they are, with the exception hopefully temporary from Turkey, they are welcome by all members. So this is perhaps one of the strongest, in political terms, not military terms, but in political terms, it's one of the strongest responses to Vladimir Putin. Then the question for the EU now, given, as Benedetta mentioned, the small, very narrow prospect for Europe-wide security architecture at the moment, what do we do between the EU and wider Europe? We have had this bold statement by the European Council granting Ukraine and Moldova candidate status. That is fine, but that is not solving anything for the moment, certainly not the war. And it's full of uncertainties, of course, because nobody knows what the final shape of the conflict will produce. But meanwhile, this has put back on the table the idea of another mechanism or another type of activity with wider Europe, which is not accession, which is not necessarily the anteroom for accession, which is not the alternative to accession, but which is a way to conduct a political and security dialogue with these European countries that are not part of the EU today. And we have a proposal from the French president, we have a proposal from the president of the European Council, we have private personalities, Alex Stubb, Enrico Letta, and others who have put forward ideas. This is the discussion going to take place in the autumn, and it is extremely important as a short-term response to the Russian invasion.
I'm going to move to Sinan now to ask a little bit about Turkey, but then I want to bring it back to all of you. There's a lot of concern. I mean, to bring it back to a different another security threat, which is the threat to food security, not just energy. And to maybe hear from you what is being done both at the level of the EU, but also to alleviate this threat, but also at the level of the rest of the world. I mean, at least I know from where I'm sitting in the Middle East and North Africa, there's a lot of concern that aid, desperately needed aid for this region, humanitarian support, may actually be diverted. So maybe we can talk a little bit about this and there. But first, let me turn to you, Sinan, and ask you about, again, going back to Turkey. Turkey's mounting economic woes are creating conditions ahead of parliamentary elections next year that actually may make for a competitive electoral campaign. So how is President Erdogan, attempting to deal with rising energy and food prices? What kind of deals would he seek with Russia or others in the West to alleviate economic concerns ahead of an electoral year? And then I also want to tag on a small question to this, which is related to the issue of refugees. There's a lot of concern that refugees, again, are being instrumentalized and are being used as a pawn in this negotiation between the EU and Turkey. But the idea that this 30-kilometer actually zone that President Erdogan wants to create in Northeast area is partly also to displace refugees and move them out of Turkey, which is something that teams both, the president and the opposition in Turkey agree to. So back to you, Sinan.
Yes, on your first question, indeed, we have entered rather an unprecedented period in Turkish politics where Erdogan is not the front runner anymore in the electoral race. And there is indeed a palpable prospect of political change in the June 2023 elections at the latest. And a lot of that has to do with the economic situation, with ill-considered macro policies that have led to the mushrooming of inflation, resulting in the erosion in the purchasing power of the middle class. And basically this is been at the root of the political dissatisfaction with the government and Erdogan. Coupled with that are issues related to central bank reserves, and this is where Turkey has tried to get some additional support, primarily from the Gulf countries. So from UAE and Saudi, there's an expectation that these countries would come up with financial packages to help Turkey replenish the foreign exchange of the central bank. So this can be in the form of swap arrangements. It can be in the form of FDI commitments. There's also been a request for Turkey for Saudi to allow for delayed payment terms for oil purchases, which would also lessen the pressure on the FX. So these are some of the political outreach that are based on an economic objective to alleviate the economic concerns as we speak. But of course, the war has been inimical to these prospects, as it has been for many other countries, in the form of higher food inflation, higher energy inflation. And this is also one of the reasons why Turkey has been actively involved in trying to concoct a deal for the grain to be shipped from Ukraine to world markets, which could hopefully not only ensure a degree of security of supply for North Africa or for all of Africa, but also have a benign impact on food prices overall. So this is how the Turkish government is trying to steer in these difficult times. But ultimately, a lot will depend on whether they can reverse these economic trends. And right now, the chances are not very strong, because the policies we have not seen any policy reversal that have been at the root of these economic problems.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to add something on the issue of refugees? Because Sinan didn't tackle that one. Do you want to say something on this before we move to Mark?
Just 10 seconds before Mark. Sorry. Yes, indeed. I didn't want to particularly address this because there is nothing new on the Turkey-EU side regarding the refugees. I mean, the 2016 deal remains. What is new, however, is the increasingly more strident criticism that we get domestically about that deal, and also the emergence of a political party which was non-existent that has espoused the issue of refugees and is instrumentalizing it domestically, but there's still a marginal one.
Okay, on refugees, discussions are going on between Turkey and the EU on the third €3 billion tranche for refugees. There is one obvious difficulty there, is that this money cannot legally be used in the Syrian provinces where Turkey is present. Turkey has operations there, health services, houses, and this and that. But there is no internationally recognized framework for Turkey's presence in the north of Syria, so EU taxpayer money cannot be used there. Other than that, the scheme, despite all the criticism, despite, of course, refugee fatigue in Turkey, is extremely successful, including on the integration of Syrian entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, into the Turkish economy. One other sentence, just one, about food in the Mediterranean. Food shortages is one thing, food prices is another. And the situation is extremely preoccupying for Egypt, Tunisia, and other countries further afield. And I think there, whatever the arrangement for the export of Ukrainian cereals will be, and we hope, of course, there will be one, the Union should intervene in the countries where really the price effect is risking to create food shortages and social unrest, and that is the last thing we want to see. So the EU has done that before; it should do it again.
We're already seeing, Mark, on this issue that the consumer price index year on year is actually much higher in the Middle East and North Africa than it is anywhere in the rest of the world. And there's a peak now in the prices. The last time we had this peak was in 2011, actually, when the Arab uprisings broke out. So the concern there is quite significant. But it's anyway. This is a topic for another discussion. Okay, Benedetta, I don't know if you want to add anything, but I also want to kind of wrap up this event with asking all of you if you would like to make any final comments on the topics we've covered, or maybe on something we haven't covered. So Benedetta, let me start with you, then I'll go to Mark, and then end with Sinan.
I guess just very briefly, we just started to unpack what are the implication of this war on the Euro-Atlantic security order, but I think very soon we have gone into the firm understanding that there are no borders when it comes to impact of this conflict. It's already having a destabilizing impact on our broader neighborhood, including the Middle East and North Africa. We know that a lot of this is, of course, engineered. It's part of it's part of the Russian playbook to intend to deliberately manipulate and instrumentalize dependencies from energy to food security in order to gain leverage. So we see that, but nevertheless, this is going to have profoundly stabilizing impacts, which need to be concerned about. We only had an hour, so we couldn't go into the broader, what is the impact of all of this on the broader rules-based international order. But I fear if we would have gone there, we also would have seen that there is not good news, and of course it's compounded to years of Russia's brutal war in Syria and undermining international humanitarian law. So I don't have a conclusion, but what I want to say is this is really a transformative event, and the way this conflict will end, of course, also profoundly matters, which is one more reason why, of course, us as Europe, sitting here in Brussels, sitting thinking as Europe's, we are going to have to, yes, make sacrifices, but of course, this pale if we compare to the price of inaction, of the price of not supporting Ukraine and not supporting their fight for their existence and for their self-defense. So yes, it's going to be a hard few months, but of course the alternative, which is a word in which Putin's war of aggression succeeds, it's much more troubling.
It's certainly a transformative moment for the global order, for sure. And as you said, I think this is, again, another topic for much longer conversation for all of us. Mark, last comments, final comments.
Well, speaking of transformation, I think what we have seen on the part of the European Union is in fact totally unprecedented. And as some members of the European Council have said, many of these measures were simply unthinkable a few months before. So the same happened on NATO's side. So basically, we've seen the EU and NATO both at the same time reinforced as a result of the Russian aggression. Now, this being said, if you look at the votes in the 3 UN General Assembly resolutions passed since the invasion took place, the EU or the West are not exactly the only source of inspiration around the world. A lot of countries are sitting on the fence. Some countries do like the Russian model of governance, if I may call it that way, because it serves their purposes.
Absolutely.
I think we've lost Mark.
Junta in
Mark, we're not hearing you very well, but I think we got the gist of what you were saying. So I'm going to move now to Sinan with the final comment. Yes, definitely we're seeing a kind of this sense. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now of whether we're going back to kind of the non-alignment movement of the last century. But that's... So any last comments, final comments, Sinan?
Yeah, on the transformative impact, a few words finally. I think the first phase of the Western response to this unprovoked war triggered by Russia has been surprisingly successful compared to previous episodes. And here I compare particularly 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea. The political solidarity and the economic solidarity were, coalesced in a rather, in a very accelerated manner, without really any major splits within the transatlantic alliance. But now we're entering the second and possibly much more protracted phase of the conflict, because this is what we're seeing on the ground. Unfortunately, the war does not seem to have a very early conclude. That will not lead to a very early conclusion. So we're likely to see a protracted war, and this will also mean a protracted political environment that has been generated by the war. And this is indeed a new era of confrontation, which will have an economic dimension, a technology dimension, a political dimension, and a security dimension. These are all the different strands that we'll need to think again as we face the challenge of how to respond to this war. And finally, whether this is going to lead to a reconfiguration of the world order, we're still, perhaps it would be a bit too, perhaps ambitious at this moment in time. But there are indeed signs that this is going to lead to be a major milestone leading a reconfiguration of the world order, the type that we've seen in the 20th century, whether it's the First World War, Second World War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on. There are those moments in history where you go back and you can say, okay, this is where I can pinpoint the start of a new era. And very possibly, the 24th of February 2022 would be one such episode where we're going to see, a long-term era of a confrontation between the West and Russia primarily. This is at least very much the spirit of the new strategic concept that, Benedetta had a major role in. But even beyond that, how the rest of the world will react to this, whether they will find to be more opportunistic to side themselves with nations like China and Russia and Iran that seem to go in a parallel direction, given that Russia will become much more dependent on China in the years to come under these circumstances, or whether the West can, attract them through its, soft power, through its style of governance, also through its economic narrative and economic success story. So these are all the questions that will remain with us in the years to come, I think.
Absolutely true, Sinan. Sinan, Benedetta, and Mark, who I think is having some connection problems. I can't thank you enough for a wonderful conversation. Very depressing, but very insightful. And I'm sure we're going to have lots of opportunities to continue this discussion in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Until the next time. Next week also we'll have the third installment of this Ukraine conflict series. There we'll be focusing on China, India, and the Middle East. So thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.